Bob Dylan froze mid-verse, his fingers still moving across the guitar strings, but his lips never reached the microphone. He saw the man standing in the shadows at the back of the stage. And 40 years collapsed into a single breath. The Beacon Theater, New York City. October 2019. Another stop on the never-ending tour, a title that had stopped being ironic somewhere around year 25 and had become something closer to a life sentence Dylan had imposed on himself. The venue held maybe 2,000 people. Dylan didn't look at them much anymore. He'd learned decades ago that looking into the audience only showed you what you'd lost. The young faces that once hung on every word now replaced by aging pilgrims who treated his concerts like religious obligation. They came to witness, not to listen. He was 3 songs into the set. Simple Twist of Fate. A song he played 10,000 times in 50 different arrangements, the lyrics so embedded in muscle memory he could sing them in his sleep. His band, the latest configuration of talented musicians who understood their job was to follow, never to lead, played behind him with professional precision. Dylan's voice, ravaged by time and cigarettes, and the sheer weight of having sung for 60 years, cracked its way through the second verse. His fingers found the chord changes automatically. His eyes, hidden partially beneath the brim of his fedora, stared at the microphone stand. And then he saw movement in the shadows. Stage left. Beyond the monitor speakers. In that dead space where stagehands stood during performances, invisible to the audience but visible to anyone on stage who knew where to look. A man. Tall. Maybe 70. Gray hair. Wearing a worn leather jacket. Dylan's fingers kept playing. The chord progression continued, G to D to C. His hands operating independently from his brain. But his mouth stopped forming words. His lips hovered maybe an inch from the microphone, frozen mid-verse, the next line of the song trapped somewhere between memory and voice. The band noticed first. The drummer glanced at the bassist. The guitarist looked toward Dylan, expecting some signal, some indication this was an intentional pause. Dylan stood completely still. Only his hands moved, mechanically completing the chord sequence while the rest of his body had turned to stone. The audience began to sense something was wrong. The confident murmur of a crowd watching a professional performance shifted into uncertain silence. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. To understand what happened on that stage, you need to understand what happened in 1965. Dylan wasn't always Dylan. The mythology, the Nobel Prize, the voice of a generation label he'd spent 50 years trying to shake. In 1965, he was 24 years old and already suffocating under the weight of expectations he never asked for. The folk music community that had embraced him now demanded he stay pure. Stay acoustic. Stay political. Stay theirs. But Dylan was changing. The music in his head had electricity in it. The songs wanted drums and bass, and the raw energy of rock and roll. He was reading French poetry and listening to the Beatles and feeling something shift inside him that had nothing to do with protest songs or social movements. He made a decision that would define the next 6 decades of his life. He was going to go electric at the Newport Folk Festival. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Pete Seeger allegedly tried to cut the power cables with an axe. The audience booed. The folk establishment that had built him up turned on him with the fury of betrayed believers. Dylan walked off that stage feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. Backstage, in the chaos of shouting and recriminations, one person didn't yell, didn't lecture, didn't try to convince Dylan to apologize or explain himself. His name was Michael Garrett. Roadie. Guitar tech. One of those invisible people who make concerts possible, but whose names never appear on any poster or album credit. He was maybe 30 years old, quiet, the kind of person who understood that some people needed silence more than they needed words. Michael found Dylan sitting alone behind a stack of equipment cases, his electric guitar still in his hands, staring at nothing. He sat down next to Dylan. Didn't say anything. Just sat. After maybe 10 minutes, Dylan finally spoke. Did I just end my career? Michael shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe you just started it. Dylan looked at him. Everyone hates me. Everyone hates change, Michael said. Doesn't mean you were wrong. They sat there for another hour while the festival continued without Dylan. People shouted his name looking for him. Producers and managers and reporters and angry folk purists all searching for the traitor who'd plugged in an electric guitar. Michael never left. Never tried to convince Dylan of anything. Just sat beside him in the darkness behind the stage, providing the only thing Dylan needed in that moment, someone who didn't require him to be anyone but himself. Before Dylan left that night, Michael said one thing. Whatever you do next, don't apologize. Don't explain. Just play. Dylan never forgot that. And for the next 40 years, whenever he felt the weight of expectations crushing him, whenever he questioned whether he'd made the right choice, he'd remember the roadie who sat with him in the darkness and told him he didn't owe anyone an explanation. He tried to find Michael afterward. Asked around? Sent word through the music industry grapevine. But Michael Garrett had vanished. Maybe he'd quit the road. Maybe he'd gone back to whatever small town he came from. Maybe he'd died. Dylan had carried that night with him for 4 decades. The memory of the only person who'd understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to apologize for becoming who you need to be. And now, in October 2019, on a stage in New York City, that person was standing in the shadows watching him play. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. The song ended. Dylan's fingers completed the final chord even though he'd stopped singing 30 seconds earlier. The audience applauded, uncertain, sensing they'd witnessed something unplanned but not understanding what. Dylan set his guitar on its stand. He didn't announce the next song. He didn't make any of his usual cryptic stage banter. He just walked across the stage toward the shadows where Michael stood. The band looked at each other. The audience murmured. Stage managers whispered frantically into headsets. Dylan stopped in front of Michael. The two men stared at each other, 24-year-old Dylan and 70-year-old Michael occupying the same impossible space as 80-year-old Dylan and 70-year-old Michael. You came, Dylan said, his voice so quiet it didn't reach the microphones. Michael nodded. Heard you were still playing. Never stopped. I know. They stood there in silence. Two men who'd shared maybe 90 minutes of total conversation across their entire lives but who'd somehow understood each other in a way that transcended words. I never thanked you, Dylan finally said. For Newport. For sitting with me. Michael shook his head. Didn't need thanks. You did what you had to do. Everyone hated me. For about 6 months. Then they realized you were right. Dylan almost smiled. Almost. Took longer than 6 months. Fair enough. The audience was getting restless. The band waited for some signal. The venue manager was probably having a heart attack in the control booth. Dylan reached into his pocket and pulled out a guitar pick. Old, worn, the kind of thing a musician carries more out of habit than necessity. He handed it to Michael. Newport, 1965, Dylan said. The electric set. This is the pick I used. Michael stared at it. You kept it? Kept a lot of things. Most of them I don't know why. This one I do. Dylan, I can't. You already did, Dylan interrupted. 54 years ago. This is just me catching up. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. Dylan walked back to center stage. He picked up his acoustic guitar, the same model he'd played at Newport before everything changed. The band waited for his signal. Instead of launching into the next scheduled song, Dylan spoke directly to the audience. He rarely did this. His concerts were famously light on banter, heavy on music, completely devoid of explanation. There's someone here tonight, Dylan said, his voice rough and low. Who was there at the beginning? When I made a choice that changed everything. He didn't tell me I was right or wrong. He just sat with me when everyone else wanted answers I didn't have." The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something rare. "Michael Garrett," Dylan continued, looking back toward the shadows where Michael still stood, clutching the guitar pick. "Come out here." Michael shook his head, trying to back away further into the darkness. But a stagehand, following some instinct that this moment mattered more than protocol, gently guided him toward the light. Michael stepped into the edge of the stage illumination, uncomfortable, a man who'd spent his entire life in the background suddenly thrust into visibility. Dylan gestured to his acoustic guitar. "You taught me I didn't owe anyone an explanation. But I want to explain something anyway. To you. To everyone here." He adjusted the microphone. "Newport, 1965. I played 3 songs electric and walked off to booze and hatred. Backstage, this man sat with me and said, 'Whatever you do next, don't apologize. Just play.'" Dylan's fingers found the opening chords to "Like a Rolling Stone." The song that had started it all, the electric anthem that had split his career into before and after. "I've been following that advice for 54 years, Dylan said. "Never apologized. Never explained. Just played." He looked at Michael one more time. "This is me breaking that rule. Just once. To say thank you." And then Bob Dylan did something he never did. He played "Like a Rolling Stone" on acoustic guitar, stripped down to its bones, the way it might have sounded if he'd never plugged in at all. The audience didn't understand the full weight of what they were witnessing. They couldn't know about the roadie who sat with a 24-year-old Dylan in the darkness. They couldn't know about the 40 years of silence between 2 men who'd shared one crucial moment. But they felt something. 3,000 people holding their breath as Dylan sang about falling from grace, about losing everything you thought defined you, about discovering who you are when all the pretense is stripped away. When the song ended, Michael was crying. Standing in the shadow at the edge of the stage, clutching a guitar pick from 1965, watching the man he'd sat with in the darkness 54 years ago still refusing to apologize for being himself. Dylan nodded to him once. Michael nodded back. Then Dylan turned back to his band, picked up his electric guitar, and launched into the rest of the set without another word of explanation. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. After the show, Dylan's tour manager tried to find Michael. Wanted to get his contact information, maybe arrange something official, a photo, an interview, documentation of this moment for the archives. But Michael Garrett had already left. Vanished into the New York City night the same way he'd vanished in 1965. No photo. No interview. No desire to be part of the story. He left behind only the guitar pick on Dylan's dressing room table with a note written on the back of a set list. "Still don't need thanks. Keep playing." Dylan kept that note. It sits in a frame in his home, next to the original guitar pick from Newport. 3 months later, Dylan received word that Michael Garrett had died. Quietly. In a small town in Oregon. The obituary mentioned he'd worked in music briefly in the 1960s, but spent most of his life as a carpenter. Dylan didn't attend the funeral. He never explained why. But at his next concert he played "Like a Rolling Stone," acoustic again. And every night after, somewhere in the set, he plays one song stripped down, no electricity, no amplification, just voice and guitar. The audience thinks it's a stylistic choice. A tempo change. Dylan being Dylan. They don't know it's a thank you. A nightly ritual. For the man who sat with him in the darkness, and told him he didn't need to apologize for becoming himself. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Bob Dylan never explained that night at the Beacon Theater. He never mentioned Michael Garrett in interviews. He never told anyone what the acoustic songs meant. Because Michael was right. He didn't owe anyone an explanation. He just kept playing.